When I saw that on my console as Capcom, I said, we're dead in the water. We're losing the computer. We're not going to be able to finish.
What if everything you thought you knew about the moon landings was only half the story? Charles Duke spent 71 hours walking on another world, and what he saw up there still haunts him to this day. The photographs lied. The documentaries left things out. And now, as one of the last surviving moonwalkers, he is finally ready to reveal what the moon is really like. Trust me, you are not prepared for this. The invisible astronaut with 2 lives. Before Charles Duke ever set foot on the moon, the world already knew his voice, even if it didn't know his face. During the historic Apollo 11 mission, millions heard a calm, southern drawl cutting through the tension from mission control. When Neil Armstrong announced that the Eagle had landed, it was Duke who responded, confirming that humanity's first lunar landing was successful. In that moment, his voice became woven into history. Yet while Armstrong and Aldrin became global icons, Duke remained a crucial presence operating behind the scenes. Serving as Capcom placed Duke in one of the mission's most demanding roles. He wasn't simply relaying instructions, he was the single human connection between Earth and 2 men balancing on the edge of the unknown. Every word had to be precise and reassuring. Duke later reflected that when Armstrong finally touched down, the relief was overwhelming for those guiding them from the ground. Despite the significance of his role, Duke received no public celebration. He described himself as the invisible astronaut, someone deeply involved in the space age's greatest achievement, but standing on the wrong side of the glass. While others planted flags, Duke carried responsibility. While others were photographed, he listened, calculated, and steadied voices through a headset. This experience shaped him in ways few could understand. As Capcom, Duke lived the mission emotionally, even though his body remained on Earth. He felt the tension in his bones and the weight of knowing that the smallest misjudgment could cost lives. Duke later admitted that the intensity of those moments stayed with him long after Apollo 11 concluded. Years later, when Duke was selected for Apollo 16, his journey took on a rare duality. Unlike any other astronaut, he carried 2 perspectives into space. He was not only an explorer, but also someone who had once guided explorers. He knew what it meant to be the voice of calm during uncertainty. When he finally walked on the moon, he did so with a deeper awareness than most. He wasn't just experiencing the surface, he was comparing it to years of simulations, data, and second-hand accounts. Duke acknowledged that no other living astronaut shares this exact viewpoint. He was both the emotional anchor of Apollo 11 and the youngest man to walk on the moon. That combination gave him a unique authority. His words had once guided Armstrong through the final moments before touchdown. Later, those same words echoed inside his own helmet as he stood on another world. For decades, Duke kept his reflections private. Apollo 16 never achieved the legendary status of earlier missions, and his role faded into the background. Yet, as he grew older, Duke realized his story mattered, not because of secrets, but because it revealed the full truth of what the Apollo program demanded. He represents the silent expertise that made the impossible possible. Beyond the fame of the first steps, Duke's legacy is defined by a rare bridge between the silent command of Earth and the lonely dust of the lunar highlands. But when Duke finally stood on the lunar surface himself, what he encountered didn't match the moon he thought he already knew, and that unsettling realization would challenge everything he believed about humanity's nearest neighbor. When the moon didn't look like the pictures. When Charles Duke finally descended onto the lunar surface during Apollo 16, he carried with him years of preparation, simulations, and expectations. From mission control, from training modules, and from watching earlier crews, the moon had been presented as a familiar concept, a grey, rocky world under a dark sky. Duke believed he knew exactly what awaited him. What he encountered instead was something far more jarring, something no rehearsal had prepared him for. The first shock came not from the ground beneath his boots, but from what hovered above him. The lunar sky was not dotted with stars or softened by distant light. It was an absolute blackness, deeper than any night sky on Earth. Duke described it as a void so complete it felt unnatural, almost oppressive. There was no atmospheric glow, no gradient, no sense of depth, just darkness without texture. On Earth, even the darkest skies carry traces of light. On the Moon, that comfort didn't exist. This darkness became even more unsettling when paired with the surface itself. The lunar ground reflected sunlight with an intensity Duke hadn't anticipated. Rocks, dust, and ridges appeared painfully bright, creating a violent contrast between light and shadow. Shadows didn't fade or blur the way they do on Earth. They cut sharply across the terrain, stark and absolute. Every object looked unnaturally crisp, as though etched into place. Duke later emphasized that cameras never captured this reality. The photographs people have studied for decades flattened the experience, muting what was overwhelming to the human eye. One of the most surprising revelations Duke later shared involved something people assume every astronaut experienced: seeing Earth from the Moon. Popular imagery suggests astronauts standing in awe, gazing at a blue planet floating above the horizon. For Apollo 16, that image was largely a myth. Earth was positioned directly overhead, not along the horizon, making it almost impossible to see. Duke explained that when he attempted to look up, all he saw was the inside of his helmet. The design of the spacesuit, essential for survival, became a barrier to that iconic moment. The helmet restricted vision to a forward-facing bowl, limiting peripheral and upward sight. Turning one's head wasn't enough. The entire body had to rotate. Bending backward to look overhead was impractical and unsafe. As a result, the poetic image of Earthrise simply didn't exist for him. This realization bothered Duke, not because he felt deprived, but because it contradicted how the moon landing had been portrayed to the world. Movement on the surface brought its own challenges. The suit wasn't built for comfort or grace. Duke described it as operating inside a rigid machine, one that resisted natural motion. Simple actions like scanning the landscape required exaggerated movements. Side vision was almost non-existent, and awareness of surroundings depended on deliberate, careful positioning. The moon wasn't a place you casually looked around. It demanded constant effort just to perceive it. Despite these limitations, the emotional impact was profound. Duke spoke about the environment as something spiritually intense. The moon felt stripped of all softness. There was no air, no sound, no visual warmth. Nothing moved unless you moved it. That stillness, combined with the extreme contrast of light and darkness, created a sense of isolation unlike anything he had experienced. It wasn't merely beautiful, it was unsettling. This is where Duke believes history went wrong. Over time, the moon was turned into scenery, a backdrop for heroism and celebration. In reality, he felt it was a place that did not welcome human presence. It existed independently, indifferent to whether anyone stood upon it. Duke wanted people to understand that difference. The moon was not a gentle extension of Earth. It was a foreign environment that tested the limits of perception and endurance. And if the visuals alone were so misrepresented, Duke argues that what the astronauts actually accomplished on the surface has been misunderstood even more, especially on a mission history almost forgot. The mission history forgot. While public memory continues to orbit around Apollo 11, Charles Duke has long carried a quieter frustration, the near erasure of Apollo 16's scientific legacy. Unlike the first landing, his mission wasn't defined by a single dramatic moment or a poetic sentence transmitted to Earth. Instead, it unfolded as a demanding, methodical effort focused on discovery. Duke believes this is precisely why it slipped from popular attention, despite achieving results that permanently reshaped lunar science. Apollo 16 was not designed as a symbolic repeat of earlier missions. Its objectives were precise and ambitious. Duke and Commander John Young were sent to the Descartes Highlands, a region chosen specifically to answer unresolved questions about the moon's formation. Scientists expected to find volcanic material that would confirm long-standing theories. What they discovered instead challenged those assumptions and forced researchers to reconsider how the moon evolved over time. One of the mission's most overlooked achievements was the deployment of the first telescope ever placed directly on the moon's surface. This was not an orbital instrument or a remote observatory controlled from Earth. It was physically installed in lunar soil and designed to observe far ultraviolet light, wavelengths blocked entirely by Earth's atmosphere. From this airless platform, scientists were able to study stars and galaxies in a way never before possible. Duke later described it as opening a new window to the universe, yet few outside scientific circles remember it happened at all. Time on the surface was another defining factor. Apollo 16 astronauts spent 71 hours on the moon, nearly 3 full days of sustained work. This was not ceremonial exploration. Duke and Young drove the lunar rover across 16 miles of rough terrain, navigating slopes, craters, and unpredictable ground. Each excursion required careful planning, physical exertion, and constant awareness of life support limits. Every movement mattered. The samples they collected remain among the most important ever returned. By the end of the mission, Apollo 16 had gathered 209 pounds of lunar material, representing a wide range of geological features. These weren't just rocks for display. They were pieces of the moon's history, taken from areas never before explored. Decades later, laboratories are still studying those samples, extracting new insights with technologies that didn't exist at the time. In addition to physical samples, Apollo 16 carried advanced instruments designed to map the moon's chemical composition. X-ray and gamma-ray spectrometers measured elements such as iron, titanium, and magnesium across the surface. The data they returned contradicted earlier models and suggested a far more complex lunar past. Duke emphasized that this information continues to influence planetary science today, even as the mission itself fades from mainstream narratives. Despite all this, Apollo 16 never gained the cultural prominence of other flights. It lacked Apollo 13's life-or-death crisis and Apollo 11's historical first. Duke understands why drama captures attention, but he remains troubled by what gets lost as a result. For him, forgetting Apollo 16 means forgetting why astronauts accepted such risks in the first place. The mission was about knowledge, not spectacle. Even moments of levity carried risk. Duke later recounted how he and Young experimented with hopping in the moon's low gravity during downtime. One miscalculated leap sent Duke falling backward, an incident that could have damaged his life support system. He admitted the mistake without humor, using it as an example of how unforgiving the lunar environment truly was. There were no unnecessary stunts on the moon, but as Duke watched his mission slip into obscurity, a different challenge emerged, one that didn't question Apollo 16's importance, but whether the moon landings happened at all. Standing face to face with denial. As decades passed, and Apollo shifted from lived memory to archived history, Charles Duke found himself confronting a challenge he never anticipated. It didn't come from the dangers of spaceflight or the harshness of the lunar surface, but from people on Earth who insisted the moon landings never happened. For Duke, this denial struck deeper than casual skepticism. It felt like an erasure of effort, risk, and sacrifice, not only his own, but that of everyone who placed their lives on top of a rocket with no guarantee of return. Duke has spoken openly about encounters with individuals who challenged him directly. In one documented moment, a man confronted him and bluntly claimed the Apollo missions were fabricated. Duke did not respond with anger or mockery. Instead, he met the accusation with calm certainty. He simply stated that he had been there. The power of that response lay not in emotion, but in credibility built over a lifetime of experience. Unlike most astronauts, Duke's authority comes from an unmatched position. He was the voice in mission control, guiding Neil Armstrong, during Apollo 11's descent, and later one of the men who physically walked on the moon during Apollo 16. This dual role makes his testimony difficult to dismiss. He wasn't recounting second-hand information or repeating official narratives. He was describing events he both managed and lived through. What frustrates Duke most is not disbelief itself, but the ease with which people dismiss the realities of the Apollo era. He reminds audiences that these missions occurred at a time when technology was far less advanced than today. Computers were primitive, simulations were limited, and every calculation involved real uncertainty. Astronauts climbed aboard rockets knowing there was no precedent for many of the risks they were taking. Denial, in Duke's view, ignores the courage required simply to attempt such missions. When challenged, Duke relies on details that cannot be convincingly fabricated. He speaks about the physical sensations of lunar gravity, where movement became a series of controlled bounds rather than steps. He recalls how the sun's unfiltered heat bore down on his suit, even as the surrounding shadows remained brutally cold. He describes the silence, not peaceful, but absolute, broken only by radio transmissions and the sound of his own breathing. One of the most persistent details he mentions is lunar dust. The fine, abrasive material clung to everything. It worked its way into joints, seams, and equipment, creating constant complications. Duke emphasizes that no studio or special effects team could convincingly reproduce such problems across multiple missions, locations, and crews. The evidence exists not only in memory, but in the physical reality of returned samples and damaged equipment still archived today. Duke also points to the hundreds of pounds of moon rocks stored in laboratories around the world. These samples have been studied for decades by scientists from multiple countries, including those politically opposed to the United States at the time. Their composition, age, and properties are consistent and verifiable. For Duke, the idea that such evidence could be fabricated collapses under even basic scrutiny. Despite this, Duke admits the denial still angers him, not because he needs validation, but because it diminishes the collective achievement of thousands of engineers, technicians, and support staff who made Apollo possible. It reduces their work to a lie and turns real danger into entertainment for speculation. Duke refuses to let that stand unchallenged. Now, with time narrowing and fewer moonwalkers left alive, Duke feels an urgency unlike anything he experienced during Apollo, a final responsibility that shapes how he speaks today. Racing time to protect the truth. As Charles Duke enters the final chapter of his life, the weight he carries is no longer physical, it is historical. Of the 12 men who walked on the moon, only a handful remain alive, and Duke is keenly aware of what that means. With each passing year, Apollo shifts further from living memory into written record. For Duke, that transition is dangerous. Once the voices are gone, stories become easier to distort, simplify, or dismiss entirely. Duke has spoken openly about this awareness. He knows that when his generation is gone, no first-hand witnesses will remain to counter misinterpretations or denial. That reality has driven him to step out of the background and speak more publicly than ever before. Where he once remained quiet, content to let history speak for itself, he now feels compelled to give it a voice while he still can. In recent years, Duke has increased his public appearances, participating in interviews, museum talks, classroom visits, and extended discussions aimed at preserving the reality of Apollo. His goal is not nostalgia. He does not dwell on glory or personal achievement. Instead, he focuses on what the moon landings represented, a moment when humans accepted enormous risk in pursuit of knowledge and progress. Duke emphasizes that Apollo was never meant to be the end of the story. To him, the moon was a proving ground, a place where humanity learned how to operate beyond Earth. The skills developed during Apollo, precision, cooperation, resilience, were lessons meant to carry forward. He sees modern programs like Artemis as a continuation of that original vision, rather than a revival of the past. When Duke speaks to younger audiences, he often frames Apollo as a challenge to imagination. He wants students to understand that the moon landings were not inevitable. They were the result of belief, effort, and persistence. At the time, no one knew for certain the missions would succeed. Rockets exploded, systems failed, yet people pressed forward anyway. Duke believes that mindset matters just as much today as it did in the 1960s and 70s. He also shares more personal reflections now, acknowledging his own mortality with honesty. Duke does not dramatize it, but he doesn't shy away from it either. He knows his days are limited, and that knowledge sharpens his sense of purpose. He wants his grandchildren's generation to inherit an accurate understanding of Apollo, not filtered through conspiracy, exaggeration, or myth. For Duke, the moon was never about planting a flag or winning a political contest. It was about testing the limits of what humans could accomplish together. He stresses that Apollo required trust across disciplines and institutions. Engineers trusted astronauts. Astronauts trusted machines. Entire teams trusted one another under conditions where failure meant death. That collective effort is what he hopes people remember. Charles Duke's story isn't about nostalgia or spectacle. It's a reminder of human courage, fragile truth, and unfinished ambition. So the question remains, will we protect that legacy or let it quietly fade away? Share your thoughts in the comments below.